How is the American Revolution taught in British schools? Reading some of the comments on here, I think people need to understand that Britain has history going back millennia, while America has history that goes back a few hundred years. Other than the Civil War and American Revolution, there hasn't really been anything else in American history that is comparable to hundreds of wars/battles in British history, whether internationally or domestic. So, for America, these two events are massive, while they pale into insignificance in the UK. Even WW2 had a lot more happening in the UK than in the US, who joined the effort later. America didn't experience the Blitz, the rationing or the evacuation of children from urban areas, for example. Nor did America have to rebuild cities and infrastructure, or deal with a whole generation of men wiped out or damaged by the war on the same scale as the UK. Other than troops deploying to Europe, life mostly continued as normal in America. Although to the Americans, the revolution is extremely important in the founding of their nation, in British history it's just a footnote. The war itself was just seen as a part of the larger war with France. France backed the fledgling USA, trying to distract Britain from the war in Europe. Britain had to invest more heavily in North America than the French did, so it was a worthwhile distraction. The fact that the USA won was a bit of a surprise to both the French and the British. It's not why would it be, it was a huge deal for America, but for the UK it was just another war in a crapload of wars. Oh well, that's that colony gone. Whatever. The only overseas British interest I learned about was India, namely Gandhi and the partition of 1947. I learned about the Reformation, the dissolution of the monasteries, the English Civil War, and all the boring shit that happened before, during, and after. The only bit about America I learned about pre-20th century American history was Francis Drake, and only because he was Elizabeth I's favorite slam piece. Edit to add, we don't even cover our old prison island of Australia, and they still technically, only technically before anyone gets angry, belong to the Commonwealth. So why would we bother with America? Oh, and also I forgot another bit we covered that had a lot about America pre-20th century, the slave trade. You gotta understand how much is considered more important for the Brits. One colony says screw you and overthrows them, no big deal. Other than us being a superpower now, it is kind of insignificant for them to learn, I guess. You don't gain much tactical knowledge, for instance, other than don't line up in bright red coats, while Americans are hiding in the trees ambushing you, and you don't need a full class to learn that lesson. It's been learned. Also, don't trust the French if you're British. Can I get a Vive la France to our oldest ally? America and France undefeated when allied, yo. It isn't really. It's a good tell of your age and location in the country as to what you were taught, but like most countries, British kids have a focus on history that affected the UK. I don't think it's deliberate in the sense of let's pretend we didn't lose, but given the earliest most people seem to be mentioning is the Romans, we had this too. That's still 2000 years of history to cram into a few years. It's just not important enough, I don't think. I learnt about the American Revolution in A-level history. For non-British redditors, A-levels are taken between 16 and 18 and most people take 3, some 4. It was a pretty small section, 1 of 7, in a British Empire paper worth 30% of the A-level. We learnt from 1763 to 1783, so the build up to, and the events of the war. We covered the basics. That is the Tea Party, the Townsend duties, the Boston Massacre and the key battles of Saratoga and Yorktown and the role of Washington and Cornwallis and others. It didn't go particularly in depth, although we did do some interesting stuff on ideological aspects and Thomas Paine. Unfortunately, for anyone who has done A-levels or GCSEs under the British education system will realize that teachers exist purely to recite the textbook into your head. There's so much content to get through that you can't get a real feel of the topic in hand. NVM. Going to uni to do history in October, so hopefully we'll get a more enjoyable experience then. When I was in school we did learn a bit about it, but it was only a small part of the topic of the British Empire, and even that was only focused on because of slavery and the Atlantic slave trade. What you have to remember is even though the American Revolution is a massive part of American history, it's a tiny piece of history for the British. Yes, in the grand scheme of things you can see how costly it is, but back then it was just another colonial war. The chances are without support from France the British would have won. Now I'm not saying they let you win, as that is simply not true. But with the strengthening of the force in India, the war in the Americas just wasn't worth the money they were pumping into it, especially as they had more profitable ventures in Asia. It's really not. Whilst it may be a huge deal to Americans, it's not a big deal at all to us. Given how isolated America is from most of the rest of the world, and how young the country is, freedom from Britain can take up quite a large portion of their history, I imagine. But when British history is being taught the literal thousands of years of history we and our closely neighboring countries have, America's involvement is just nothing. What's one revolution in comparison to the dozens and dozens of others we've been a part of? The most we learn about America is the involvement they had in the cotton trade, to be honest. A lot of people saying it wasn't covered. I'm guessing there's quite a range of times people were in school. We definitely covered the Boston Tea Party at least once, and we definitely were taught that the US broke away because of high taxes and a lack of representation. There was not a lot of detail or context though. I didn't realize that the America breaking away was only 13 states and not the whole country as it is now. War of 1812 was not covered at all. Some other people mentioning that colonialism wasn't covered. Well, British India and the Raj and the scramble for Africa were absolutely taught at higher ages, and part of the World War II teaching ended on the fact that decolonization happened after. There's a huge amount of stuff to cover in history going back more than 2000 years, so a lot of it isn't covered in huge detail, and as a kid, the bits that are easy to understand and remember, and are very cool, so interesting, are the big foundational national identity stories: Romans Battle of Hastings, Norman Conquest, Tudors, Henry VIII and his wives, Spanish Armada, World Wars I and II. I don't know why Americans are saying that the British are omitting history where they did something nasty. The answer is the same as asking any other country why they don't teach the American Revolution in school. Because there's so much you can fit into the curriculum, and world wars were far more important in modern history. So people just teach their own country's history, plus the world wars. More expansive history lessons usually belong in higher education, where most people probably chose to stop studying history at that point anyways. Besides, I don't really think the British really view the revolution as something they should be ashamed of anyways. British history teacher here. It isn't. There is just far too much to try and cover to try and dedicate any time to it. It may be mentioned in some level 16 to 18 courses, but probably not in a great level of detail. I know that it's a central part of your culture, but it's barely known over here. People will likely know it happened, but won't be able to tell you a thing about. There's also no emotional connection. Nobody here cares that it happened. Nobody is bitter about it. There is a small minority of Americans that like to say something like "yeah, but we beat you guys in the War of Independence" if you get into a discussion with them. Anyone from the UK is like "yeah, so that was like 250 years ago. Also, I wasn't there. I never learnt it in secondary school, but I was taught it in 6th form, 16 to 18 for any non-Brits. The course goes over the 7 Years' War to give context to the later taxation efforts and the feeling from Britain that the 13 colonies needed to be defended. It went into the build-up such as the Mercantile Acts, I believe called the Intolerable Acts in the US, as well as the Boston Massacre and the Tea Party. It then goes over the war itself, including French involvement and British military mistakes failing to capitalize on victories against Washington. Finally, it ends with British and US relations improving under John Adams due to the increase in tensions between the US and France. Oh, and it talks about the failings of the initial US government before the reforms. Bear in mind I have left a lot out as I did this a few years ago, and it was a 2-year module. Quite a while since I was at school, but to the best of my memory I was either told or read sometime in primary school that it happened, and when, that George Washington done it and Paul Revere rode with a message, and those idiots wasted good tea. I think we spent about 10 minutes on it. I don't specifically think it was glossed over. We were taught about times we were the villains and times we lost. Our history lessons weren't particularly biased in our favor. It's just the American Revolution is a big deal to Americans. It is the birth of their country and they don't have a lot of history. But to us, it is a little thing that happened a long way away and neither particularly meaningful or interesting. We have a lot of history to cover, and a lot of it is far closer to home. We have castles, Iron Age forts, World War defenses, etc. here, close by, that we can actually visit when learning about them. We have things like WWI and WWII and the Industrial Revolution that actually impacts how our lives are today, so they tend to be covered as they're much more relevant. And we have stuff like the Roman and Viking invasions, our own civil war, and the entire medieval period, which basically reads like Game of Thrones minus the dragons, and is much more interesting to study. So it isn't that the American is deliberately ignored, it is just that we have a limited time at school, and an even more limited time dedicated to history within that time, and the American Revolution simply isn't a big enough event to rank high enough to be fit into the syllabus. History I learned, as far as I can remember, the Tudors, the Great Fire of London, the Second World War, the First World War, Queen Victoria, British Civil War, Holocaust, separate to WW2. We did WW2 in primary and Holocaust in Y9 or so. Guy Fawkes History of Medicine for GCSE. Edit. All my fellow Brits out here claiming it ain't in the curriculum. Come on bruh, we all know there's like 5 different exam boards for A levels, and probably half the country's population drops out before A levels anyway. Don't claim it's not taught, just because you weren't taught it. I bloody sweated through this shit for 2 years. I demand my pain to be acknowledged. Learnt it for my A levels, exams to get into uni, last year. I got an A, but I can't remember much. What I can remember is that in terms of fault, it was thanks to both sides. Both unreasonableness on the Americans' part and stupidity on the British's part. The British thought it fair to increase taxes on the American colonies following the 7 Years' War, as the 7 Years' War had been, in their eyes, one for the benefit of those in the American colonies, and yet the colonists had done little to contribute to the war. Increasing taxes was therefore felt as completely justified. I think this question shows how America-centric our US national curriculum is. Even in world history, once you get past Christopher Columbus, touted as a hero, no less, every event is taught through a lens of American involvement. Even WWI is taught as this great American victory that showed America's greatness. I didn't learn until college that we only came in at the end and only won because the Central Powers, like the rest of the Allied forces, were simply short on men and resources after years of fighting. We did a large section in high school specifically about American history, and the American Revolution was barely covered. Outside of the States it really isn't something anyone takes much note of. We learned about the Trail of Tears and the general push west, the gold rush etc. And we learned about Mormonism and its founding. And we learned about witches and the Salem witch trials. It was actually all extremely fascinating, and thinking back it's almost odd we didn't learn more about the revolution within the context of the above. In my school in England, the American Revolution was taught in Year 9 history lessons. That's 8th grade in US terms. This was in the 1990s. I distinctly remember being taught about the Battle of Bunker Hill as I went on to visit it later that year on a holiday to the eastern USA. I remember being taught about the Boston Tea Party, but not a huge amount more than that. I also remember being taught as part of a theme of revolutions, with the agricultural plus industrial revolutions being taught in the same term. And I'm sure we spent a lot longer on the Industrial Revolution, including a visit to a working museum at Bliss Hill and the Iron Bridge. Being an Indian, and having met several Brits in real life and plenty more online, I can say one thing: they either don't teach or teach very little about what they did to others. Imagine that some Brits broke your leg and then gave you an apple. Their history would only talk about the apple they gave you. Then they go on to suggest that it wasn't all that bad for you since you got an apple. Finally they would say that others would have broken both of your legs, and since they broke only one leg, they are angels. We did the Egyptians, Romans, and Anglo-Saxons in primary school. In secondary school 11 to 13 we did a combined humanities subject. It covered Brazil's exploitation of the Amazon, Britain's exploitation of Australia and the USA civil rights movement. For age 14 to 16 we did the Industrial Revolution, enclosure of land, Chartists, the Corn Laws and the Irish Famine. I chose to continue history from age 16 to 18 and covered British political history from the Great Reform Act 1832 to the First World War 1914 and European history from 1917 to 1945. USA independence not covered at all. Neither was Chinese history, South American or African. There's a national curriculum now, so it's hopefully a bit more standardized rather than the bits of history your teacher likes teaching. How is the American Revolution taught in British schools? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching. For more content, please consider liking this video and subscribing to my channel.